She entered the branch on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing a tailored navy suit and modest gold jewelry, phone in one hand and a slim leather wallet in the other. The air conditioning was aggressive, and the tiled floor beneath her heels echoed with each step. She'd come to authorize a transfer, something routine, something she's done at dozens of financial institutions around the world. Her company's logo, discreetly etched into her laptop case, carried the weight of $1 billion enterprise. She waited patiently in the short line, scanning emails on her phone until she reached the teller window. The teller, a young man in his late 20s, didn't look up right away. He seemed distracted, glancing at the screen, then at her, then back at the screen again. She greeted him kindly and slid her state-issued ID under the plexiglass divider, accompanied by the required forms. He squinted at the name, then at her face, then frowned. "This your ID?" he asked. She blinked, the question catching her off guard. "Yes," she said calmly, "it's valid and current." He held it up, inspecting it like it might be counterfeit. Then his tone changed, more clipped, skeptical. "You the CEO of this company?" "Yes," she said again. No need to elaborate. It was written plainly on the document she handed over. A few beats of silence passed. He looked her up and down, disbelief clear in his expression. "You got something else?" he asked. "A second form, passport maybe?" "I can pull up the digital credential," she offered, already reaching for her phone, "but that ID should be sufficient." He didn't respond. Instead, with an abrupt motion, he let the ID slip from his hand. It clattered to the floor on her side of the counter. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The quiet inside the branch became louder than any shouting ever could be. A customer behind her audibly gasped. She didn't say a word. Instead, she leaned down, picked up the ID, brushed it off, and stood tall again. Her expression betrayed no emotion. Not anger, not disbelief, just a blank professionalism honed through years of boardrooms, backrooms, and breakthroughs. The teller looked at her, then away. The silence stretched. Without further interaction, she gathered her materials, turned, and walked out of the building. Each step was measured, slow, and deliberate. She didn't glance back. There was no outburst, no confrontation, no demand for a manager. She had learned long ago that her silence often carried more power than her words ever could. Behind her, the bank continued on as if nothing had happened. The teller returned to his screen. The next customer stepped forward hesitantly. The moment to those inside may have seemed like a small misunderstanding, an awkward transaction. But that small act, the dropping of her ID, the refusal to see her authority, the disbelief in her identity, would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. She stepped outside the bank into the heavy afternoon air, sunlight bouncing off the glass towers lining the avenue. Her fingers tightened slightly around the ID in her hand, the smooth plastic still warm from where it had hit the floor. People moved past her on the sidewalk, businessmen in blazers, tourists with cameras, a delivery worker adjusting a box on his shoulder. Life didn't pause to ask what had happened. No one noticed the stillness in her face, the calculation behind her eyes. She didn't call anyone, didn't dial her assistant, didn't summon legal counsel, didn't lodge a complaint. There was nothing she needed from that place, no approval she sought, no validation required. She had walked into that branch with purpose, and now walked away with a reminder, not of her worth, but of how quickly others still questioned it. Her driver opened the door of the waiting car, and she slid into the back seat without a word. The silence remained thick between her and the city around her. The vehicle moved through traffic slowly, humming as she stared out the tinted window. Her thoughts didn't linger on the teller. She didn't remember his badge number, didn't care to. What stood out more was the space between them. How quickly disbelief had taken root in his voice. How unremarkable the incident might have seemed to him. Just another policy check. She had been here before. Not this bank, not this exact branch, but here. In this same moment of erasure, of subtle humiliation dressed up as due diligence. It had worn many faces. The cautious hotel concierge who doubled checked her reservation. The executive assistant, who assumed she was there to serve coffee. The investors who asked if she was filling in for someone more senior. Each time it came wearing different clothes, but each time it told her the same thing. The car pulled into the underground garage of her office tower. She stepped into the elevator and rode it up, floor after floor, until it opened into the marble and glass space of her company's headquarters. Her assistant greeted her with a folder of updates, including a summary of the upcoming call with the bank's senior management scheduled for the next day. She said nothing about what had happened, not then, not in the meeting that followed. She took her seat at the head of the conference table, discussed global distribution channels, revenue targets, and product timelines with her usual clarity. Her team noticed the sharper edge in her tone, the way she asked for precision, not projection. But no one asked why. The meeting with the bank's executives was meant to finalize a sprawling strategic partnership, one that had taken nearly 18 months of quiet work. A $3 billion initiative spanning digital payments, infrastructure support, and targeted community reinvestment. The final signatures were expected within the week. She had shaken hands with two of the VP just last quarter. They had posed for photos and toasted to what they called an exciting new era. That call never happened. Instead, the next morning, her chief of staff sent an email, brief, cordial, declining further participation, no reasons given, no emotion in the tone, just an abrupt, undeniable stop to all proceedings. Contracts unsigned, communications ceased, a polite, final full stop at the end of a long, careful sentence. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't tell the story at dinner parties, didn't post about it online, didn't use it as a cautionary tale in keynote speeches. She simply made a decision, one based not on anger but principle, because power, when fully realized, doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it just walks away and takes the future with it. It started with a whisper, just a single post, blurry footage from a security camera inside the bank. The angle was imperfect, the audio muted, but the moment was unmistakable. A woman standing at the teller window, composed and calm, a man behind the counter, holding her ID, then letting it drop. The soundless video caught her reaching down to pick it up, straightening, and walking out without a word. There was no context, no caption, just a question: why is this still happening? Within hours, the clip was everywhere. Social media, restless and razor sharp, did what it always does. It connected the dots. First, the obvious, a black woman in a professional setting, disrespected by a frontline worker who didn't believe she was who she claimed to be. Then came the speculation. The internet's collective eye focused on her face, her posture, the way she carried herself. Someone recognized her. A few LinkedIn screenshots followed. Soon enough, her name trended. Not just as a person, but as a symbol. People shared their own stories in the comments. Quiet humiliations in lobbies, at counters, in meetings where they were mistaken for assistants or interns despite titles that read partner, VP, or founder. The clip sparked a wave of familiarity, of rage, of painful resonance. It wasn't just about this woman, or this bank, or this day. It was about how many times people had been forced to prove their worth in spaces that had already accepted less from others who looked different. A journalist for a major outlet picked up the story, reaching out to the bank for comment. The response was brief: "We are aware of an incident that occurred at one of our branches and are reviewing internal procedures." No apology. No acknowledgement of what was clearly seen. Just language wrapped in corporate insulation that only fueled more questions. The video had no violence, no shouting. That was part of what made it so unsettling. It was quiet, almost clinical, and yet in that quiet, the entire imbalance of how power and prejudice intersect was exposed. Commentators on talk shows and podcasts picked it up, discussing it not as an isolated lapse, but as a case study in what systemic bias looks like when it hides behind policy, behind the illusion of just doing my job. A civil rights lawyer reposted the clip with the caption, "Imagine how often this happens when there aren't cameras." By the second day, memes circulated, not the mocking kind, but protest memes, juxtaposing the teller's actions with the CEO portfolio of achievements. Images of boardrooms, keynote speeches, magazine covers. A photo of her in front of the United Nations, giving a speech on economic justice. Each frame asked the same unspoken question: what else does she need to do to be seen? Still, she said nothing. No press release from her company, no statement of outrage, no interview. The silence around her only made the noise louder. People projected onto it. Some saw dignity, others saw strategy, others still felt frustration that she hadn't spoken up. But those closest to her knew she wasn't interested in spectacle. She never had been. By the end of the week, hashtags emerged, demanding accountability. Petitions circulated. Shareholders of the bank began asking questions in private meetings. The CEO image was now emblematic of a larger reckoning. It was no longer just about one incident. It was about the credibility of institutions that claimed to champion equity while enabling environments that quietly stripped people of their dignity. What stunned people most was the contrast. A woman with the capacity to move billions in capital, to shift entire industries with a decision, had been treated with suspicion while trying to make a simple transaction. And yet, when given the chance to retaliate publicly, she declined. She didn't need to speak for the world to see what had happened. The footage said enough. Her silence, her composure, and ultimately, her withdrawal from the deal. All of it carried a message no headline could improve. There was no announcement, no press conference, no warning, just silence. Silence from her office, silence from the bank, the kind that isn't empty but thick with consequence. Somewhere, deep in a string of secure inboxes and encrypted messages, the $3 billion partnership began to quietly unravel. The internal team at her firm knew something had shifted. They saw the block, tout calendar slots that weren't filled again, saw the tone of correspondence with the bank cool from collaborative to curt. The project leads had worked for months mapping out the technical architecture, assembling teams, establishing roadmaps for infrastructure, data compliance, and community impact. Yet suddenly, decisions were no longer progressing. Budgets were paused, calls were missed. Eventually, someone from the bank reached out to her chief operating officer directly. They asked for clarity, mentioned confusion over the lack of movement, wondered if there had been a delay. The COO responded with a line that sent a ripple through both sides of the deal. "We've chosen to reevaluate our alignment." Nothing more. Inside the bank, people began to whisper. Word traveled faster than the memo. A regional manager heard something from someone in risk management. A senior partner in legal confirmed that contract finalization had stalled without reason given. Executives speculated in meetings, quietly reviewing footage of the incident, aware it had gone viral, aware who the woman in the video was. Still, the upper ranks hesitated. There was no formal link tying the teller's action to the dissolution of the deal. The woman hadn't spoken out, hadn't threatened legal action, hadn't made demands. She hadn't sent a single message indicating dissatisfaction, but anyone paying attention could read the writing in the quiet. What disappeared wasn't just a contract, it was a future. The partnership had been heralded as transformative. It was supposed to modernize banking access for underserved communities across 3 continents. The initiative included digital infrastructure, community lending, microfinancing tools, and access to AI-driven financial education. The CEO firm had built platforms that allowed minority-owned businesses to scale internationally with ease, and the bank had planned to integrate those solutions into their broader ecosystem. Internal projections had valued the long-term return at over $9 billion over 10 years. Stock analysts had already speculated about the impact on quarterly performance. Marketing campaigns were drafted, names of the initiative workshopped. Everything was nearly in place, except the trust. And that trust, once fractured, was never spoken of again. Back inside her company, no one needed an explanation. Her executive team had known her long enough to understand how she moved. She had weathered storms before, had built the company from a co-working space to global relevance. She had fought for partnerships in rooms where her credentials were second, guessed by people who couldn't match her acumen. The team knew this wasn't about a teller or a single moment. It was about pattern, principle, and power. The dissolution happened over a period of 8 days. That's all it took to walk away from what would have been one of the most ambitious financial collaborations in recent years. The bank, once poised to serve as the financial backbone of this initiative, was left trying to reframe the collapse. But no version of the story worked in their favor, not without addressing what had triggered the quiet withdrawal. Eventually, they stopped trying to re-engage. On her side, no doors were closed, just this one. And when it shut, the message was clear. Her presence was a privilege, not an obligation. Her partnership was not a favor, not a quota, not a gesture of diversity. It was a choice she had every right to revoke. And revoke it she did, with the same quiet authority that had defined her career. When the bank finally issued a statement, it was brief, cautious, and clinical. A 3-paragraph note released to the press and posted on their corporate site under the banner "Commitment to Service Excellence." It avoided names, it avoided specifics, and most notably, it avoided accountability. We are aware of a situation that occurred at one of our branches. It began, and we are currently reviewing the matter internally to ensure alignment with our values and protocols. The wording was passive, the tone sterile. The phrase "situation that occurred" floated in ambiguity, giving the impression that the bank might as well have been referring to a printer malfunction or an unusually long wait time. Anything but the public dismissal of a respected Black business leader. The second paragraph gestured toward the usual talking points: employee training, diversity goals, community commitment. Words carefully arranged to signal concern without conceding responsibility. The final paragraph thanked customers for their trust and patience as we continue striving for the highest standards of professionalism. But nowhere in the statement was there an apology, no mention of the ID, no mention of the teller, no mention of the woman at the center of the storm. She had become a global topic of conversation, her silence examined, her presence dissected. And yet, in the bank's official voice, she did not exist. Public reaction was swift. Users across social media screenshotted the statement and overlaid it with captions like "Say her name." Activists, journalists, and customers alike criticized the bank's refusal to acknowledge the harm directly. They compared it to previous PR statements from other corporations caught in the tide of racial bias, how institutions learned to say, "We are listening," without actually hearing. Several prominent voices in finance spoke out, noting the glaring difference between the bank's internal ambitions and its public behavior. One former board member tweeted, "When $3B walks out your door without a word, and your only response is to review protocols, you're not just losing money, you're losing credibility." Still, the bank held its line. In internal memos leaked by a frustrated employee, it was revealed that executives had debated how to address the issue more directly, but ultimately feared legal exposure. Some wanted to issue a personalized apology. Others argued that acknowledging the identity of the woman involved could trigger reputational risk or even liability. The decision, as always, was made in the boardroom, not with empathy, but calculation. In the background, clients began to question their own partnerships. Several corporate clients requested meetings with their relationship managers, expressing concern over how the situation was being handled. A few pulled out of pending deals quietly, professionally, just like she had. No protests were staged outside the bank's branches, no one picketed, There were no chants, no boycotts, no viral campaigns demanding a firing. The impact came not from outrage but from retreat, from the choice of high-level partners and silent investors to slowly back away, from the invisible weight of reputations tarnished not by noise, but by omission. Inside the bank, tension simmered. Employees at all levels, particularly black employees, noticed the lack of direct acknowledgement. ERG groups met behind closed doors. An internal town hall was scheduled, then quietly postponed. Staff were advised to stay focused and continue upholding client trust, but trust had already been broken, not just externally, but within. By the end of the fiscal quarter, the bank's diversity task force proposed new policy guidelines, including enhanced training and a recommendation for racial bias auditing in customer service scenarios. But it all felt too late, not performative necessarily, but reactive, predictable, the kind of cleanup that comes only after something irreversible has already occurred. Meanwhile, she moved forward. Her company flourished. She redirected resources into a new partnership, one that launched quietly with a competitor bank headquartered overseas. No announcement was made. Just a press release 6 weeks later, highlighting a new global initiative for equitable finance solutions. No mention of what had come before, no comparison needed. The silence from her remained intact. But for the bank, the silence grew louder. Because in an industry that prides itself on risk management, relationship capital, and long-term vision, they had failed to recognize that the most devastating losses aren't always the ones shouted about. Sometimes they are the ones no one can stop replaying.